The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the vast expanse of the Grand Line. The sea shimmered like molten gold, and the salty breeze carried the faint scent of adventure. On the deck of the Thousand Sunny, the Straw Hat Pirates were in the midst of their usual chaos. Luffy was sprawled out on the lawn, snoring loudly with a half-eaten piece of meat in his hand, while Zoro leaned against the mast, his 3 swords resting at his side as he dozed off. Nami was busy charting their course, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Usopp tinkered with one of his inventions, muttering to himself about the ultimate sniper upgrade. Sanji, as always, was in the galley, preparing a feast that would undoubtedly be devoured in seconds. Robin sat quietly in the shade, her nose buried in a book, while Frankie and Brooke were engaged in a lively discussion about the latest modifications to the ship. Chopper, meanwhile, was busy organizing his medical supplies, humming a cheerful tune. It was a peaceful day, or at least as peaceful as it could be for a crew of pirates sailing the most dangerous sea in the world. But peace, as they would soon learn, was a fleeting thing. The calm was shattered by a sudden burst of light that erupted from the sky, blinding everyone on board. The crew shielded their eyes as the light intensified, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. In its place stood a figure, a young woman, no older than 20, with fiery red hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of flames. Her eyes, a piercing shade of amber, scanned the deck with a mixture of curiosity and determination. She wore a tattered cloak that billowed in the wind, revealing a sleek black bodysuit adorned with intricate golden patterns. In her hand, she held a strange weapon, a staff that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The crew stared at her in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of this unexpected visitor. Luffy was the first to break the silence, his eyes wide with excitement. "Whoa! Who are you? Did you fall from the sky or something?" he asked, his voice brimming with curiosity. The young woman smirked, her lips curling into a confident grin. "You could say that," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of mischief. "The name's Arya, and I'm the granddaughter of the Pirate King, Monkey D. Luffy." The declaration hung in the air like a thunderclap, leaving the crew momentarily speechless. Luffy blinked, his expression shifting from excitement to confusion. "Huh? My granddaughter? But I'm not even married yet," he exclaimed, scratching his head. Arya chuckled, her amber eyes gleaming with amusement. "Time travel is a funny thing," she said cryptically. "But I'll explain everything later. Right now, we have bigger problems to deal with." Before anyone could respond, the ship lurched violently as a massive wave crashed against the hull. The crew scrambled to steady themselves, their attention drawn to the horizon, where a dark shape was rapidly approaching. It was a ship, but unlike any they had ever seen. Its hull was made of a strange, metallic material that gleamed ominously in the sunlight, and its sails bore a symbol none of them recognized, a swirling vortex surrounded by jagged lightning bolts. As the ship drew closer, a figure emerged on its deck, towering over the crew with an air of menace. He was clad in armor that seemed to shift and change like liquid metal, and his eyes glowed with an eerie blue light. "So, you're the ones who've been causing so much trouble," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I am General Veron, and I've come to claim what is rightfully mine." The Straw Hats exchanged wary glances, their instincts kicking in. Zoro unsheathed his swords, the blades gleaming in the sunlight, while Sanji lit a cigarette, his eyes narrowing in concentration. Nami clutched her Klimatak tightly, and Usopp fumbled with his slingshot, his hands trembling slightly. Luffy stepped forward, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a steely determination. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you're not taking anything from us," he said, his voice firm. Arya stepped up beside him, her staff crackling with energy. "He's after me," she said, her tone serious. "And if he gets what he wants, the entire world will pay the price." The tension on the deck was palpable as General Veron raised his hand, signaling his crew to attack. The metallic ship unleashed a barrage of projectiles, each one glowing with a strange energy. The Straw Hats sprang into action, their movements a blur of speed and precision. Zoro dashed forward, his sword slicing through the air with deadly accuracy. "Santoru, Onigiri," he roared, his blades cutting through the projectiles with ease. Sanji followed close behind, his legs a whirlwind of motion as he delivered a series of powerful kicks. "Diable jambe, flambéed shot," he shouted, his flaming foot colliding with one of the projectiles, causing it to explode in a burst of light and heat. Nami and Usopp worked together, using their combined skills to create a makeshift barrier. "Usopp, now," Nami shouted, and Usopp launched a series of explosive pellets from his slingshot, creating a wall of smoke and debris that obscured their position. Robin, meanwhile, used her devil fruit powers to sprout arms from the enemy ship's deck, immobilizing several of Veron's crew members. Mille fleur, clutch, she said calmly, her hands crossed as the arms tightened their grip. Frankie and Brooke charged forward, their attacks a symphony of brute strength and precision. Strong right, Frankie bellowed, his mechanical fist slamming into an enemy with enough force to send them flying. Brooke twirled his sword gracefully, his movements almost poetic. Yahazu Giri, he said, his blade slicing through the air with surgical precision. Luffy and Arya, however, were focused on General Veron himself. The armored figure leapt from his ship, landing on the deck of the Thousand Sunny with a thunderous crash. Luffy wasted no time, his fist stretching back as he prepared to attack. Gamu Gamu no. Pistol, he shouted, his fist rocketing toward Veron. But the general simply raised his hand, catching Luffy's fist with ease. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through the air, but Veron didn't even flinch. Is that all you've got? He sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Arya stepped forward, her staff glowing brighter as she channeled her energy. Let's see how you handle this, she said, her voice calm but determined. She swung the staff in a wide arc, releasing a wave of energy that slammed into Veron, forcing him to release Luffy's fist and take a step back. The battle raged on, each member of the crew pushing themselves to their limits. But even as they fought, a sense of unease began to settle over them. Veron was unlike any enemy they had faced before, and his power seemed almost limitless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sea in shades of crimson and gold, the Straw Hats realized that this was only the beginning. Arya's arrival had set something in motion, something far greater and more dangerous than they could have imagined. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, the crew knew that their journey was about to take a turn they could never have predicted. The Pirate King's granddaughter had brought with her a storm, and the winds of fate were beginning to howl. The storm raged on, the waves crashing against the Thousand Sunny with a ferocity that mirrored the tension aboard. Luffy's granddaughter, Mira, stood at the helm, her fists clenched as she stared into the tempest. The crew had barely recovered from their last encounter with the mysterious time-traveling pirates, and now a new threat loomed on the horizon, a rival crew led by a man who called himself Kronos, a self-proclaimed time warden who claimed Myra's presence in this era was disrupting the flow of history. His ship, the Eternalist, was a sleek, black vessel that seemed to glide unnaturally through the storm, its sails glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. "They're gaining on us," Nami shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her eyes darted between the approaching ship and the log pose, which was spinning erratically. "Whatever they're doing, it's messing with the magnetic fields. We can't navigate like this." Mira gritted her teeth, her mind racing. She had only been in this era for a few weeks, but already her presence had caused chaos. The crew had accepted her, mostly, but doubts lingered. Zoro, in particular, had been vocal about his skepticism. "You're a liability," he'd said earlier that day, his tone sharp. "If you can't control your powers, you'll get us all killed." Now, as the Eternalist closed in, Mira could feel the weight of his words. She turned to Luffy, who was standing beside her, his straw hat pulled low over his eyes. "Grandpa, she began, but he cut her off with a grin. "Don't worry, Mira," he said, his voice steady. "We'll handle this. But you've got to trust us, and yourself. If you're gonna be a straw hat, you've got to fight like one." Before she could respond, a deafening crack split the air. A beam of light shot from the Eternalist, striking the mast of the Thousand Sunny. The wood splintered, and the mast began to topple. "Incoming!" Usopp screamed, diving for cover. Sanji leapt into action, kicking the falling mast to redirect its trajectory, sending it crashing harmlessly into the sea. "Enough of this," Zoro roared, drawing his swords. "I'm taking the fight to them." Without waiting for a response, he leapt over the railing, landing on the deck of the Eternalist with a thunderous crash. The rival crew, clad in dark, futuristic armor, turned to face him, their weapons glowing with the same eerie light as their ship. Mira hesitated, torn between staying to protect the Sunny and joining Zoro. "Go," Luffy said, his voice firm. "We'll hold them off here. But remember, Mira, this isn't just about fighting. It's about protecting your crew." Nodding, Mira activated her time-bending powers, a shimmering aura enveloping her as she leapt onto the Eternalist. The deck was slick with rain, and the air crackled with energy. Zoro was already in the thick of it, his blades a blur as he clashed with Kronos' crew. Mira joined him, her fists glowing as she manipulated time to slow her opponent's movements. A pirate swung a glowing sword at her, but she sidestepped with ease, delivering a powerful punch that sent him sprawling. "Not bad," Zoro muttered, though his tone was more grudging than complimentary. "But don't get in my way." Mira ignored him, focusing on the fight. She noticed that the crew's armor seemed to absorb the energy of their attacks, making them harder to defeat. Their armor, it's resistant to normal strikes, she shouted. We need to find another way. Zoro grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Then we'll just have to hit them harder, he said, his blades glowing with haki. He unleashed a devastating triple slash, the force of it tearing through the armor of 3 pirates at once. Mira followed up, using her powers to accelerate her movements, delivering a flurry of punches that shattered the remaining armor. But their victory was short-lived. A deep, resonant laugh echoed across the deck, and Kronos himself stepped forward. He was a tall, imposing figure, his face obscured by a mask that glowed with the same light as his ship. In his hand, he held a staff that crackled with temporal energy. Impressive, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. But you're out of your depth. The timeline must be corrected, and you, Mira, are the anomaly. Myra's heart raced, but she stood her ground. I'm not going back, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. This is my home now. Kronos chuckled, raising his staff. We'll see about that. He slammed the staff into the deck, and a shockwave of temporal energy erupted, freezing Zoro and Mira in place. The world around them seemed to slow to a crawl, the rain hanging motionless in the air. Mira struggled against the effect, her powers flaring as she fought to break free. You think you can control time? Kronos sneered, stepping closer. You're nothing but a child playing with forces you don't understand. Myra's mind raced. She couldn't move, couldn't fight back. But then she remembered Luffy's words, trust your crew. Closing her eyes, she focused on the bond she had formed with the Straw Hats, the trust they had placed in her. With a surge of determination, she unleashed a burst of temporal energy, shattering Kronos' hold. Zoro stumbled as the effect wore off, but he quickly regained his footing. About time, he growled, raising his swords. Let's finish this. The two of them charged at Kronos, their attacks synchronized for the first time. Zoro's blades clashed with the staff, while Mira used her powers to create temporal distortions, disrupting Kronos' control over time. The fight was fierce, the deck of the Eternalist shaking with the force of their clashes. But despite their efforts, Kronos seemed to grow stronger, his attacks more precise. He's feeding off our energy. Mira realized, her voice strained. We need to cut him off. Zoro nodded, his expression grim. Then we hit him with everything we've got. On my mark. Mira braced herself, her powers surging as she prepared for the final strike. Zoro unleashed a devastating attack, his blades cutting through the air with blinding speed. At the same time, Mira focused all her energy into a single, concentrated blast of temporal force. The combined attack struck Kronos head-on, the force of it sending him crashing to the deck. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a groan, Kronos struggled to his feet, his mask cracked and his staff shattered. This isn't over, he spat, his voice trembling with rage. You've only delayed the inevitable. Before they could respond, the Eternalist began to dissolve, its crew vanishing into thin air. The storm subsided, the sea calming as if nothing had happened. Zoro and Mira stood on the now empty deck, breathing heavily. We did it, Mira said, her voice filled with relief. Zoro sheathed his swords, his expression unreadable. Don't get cocky, he said. This was just the beginning. And next time, don't hesitate. Mira nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she wasn't alone. As they made their way back to the Thousand Sunny, she couldn't help but smile. She was a Straw Hat, and she would fight to protect her crew, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden hue across the endless sea as the Straw Hat pirates sailed toward their next destination. The air was thick with anticipation, a tension that had been building ever since Luffy's granddaughter, Mira, had revealed her time-traveling origins and her mission to prevent a catastrophic future. The crew had grown accustomed to her presence, but the weight of her knowledge and the secrets she carried still lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. Today, that storm was about to break. As the Thousand Sunny cut through the waves, a faint silhouette appeared on the horizon. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a speck, but as they drew closer, the shape resolved into a sleek, black ship with crimson sails. The Jolly Roger fluttering atop its mast was unfamiliar, a skull with a clock embedded in its forehead, its hands frozen at midnight. The crew tensed, hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Myra's eyes narrowed as she recognized the symbol. That's the Tempest Pirates, she said, her voice low. Their captain, Kronos, is a wild card. He's not an ally, but he's not exactly an enemy either. He's complicated. Before anyone could respond, a figure leapt from the black ship, landing gracefully on the deck of the Thousand Sunny. He was tall and lean, his silver hair tied back in a loose ponytail, and his eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. A long, curved blade rested at his side, its surface etched with intricate, glowing runes. "Mira," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an edge of menace. "I've been waiting for you." Luffy stepped forward, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by uncharacteristic seriousness. "Who the hell are you, and what do you want?" he demanded, his fists clenched. The man smirked, his gaze flicking to Luffy before returning to Mira. "Kronos," he said simply. "And I'm here to ensure the timeline remains intact. Myra's meddling has already caused ripples, and I can't allow her to continue." Myra's eyes flashed with defiance. "You don't understand, Kronos. The future I'm trying to prevent is worse than anything you can imagine. I won't let you stop me." Kronos sighed, his expression almost pitying. "You always were stubborn. But this isn't a debate, Mira. It's a warning." With that, he drew his blade, the runes flaring to life as the air around him seemed to distort, as if time itself was bending to his will. The straw hat sprang into action. Zoro was the first to strike, his three swords gleaming as he lunged at Kronos with a devastating onigiri. But Kronos moved with uncanny speed, his blade intercepting Zoro's attack with a clash that sent sparks flying. "Not bad," Kronos said, his tone almost casual. "But you'll need more than brute strength to take me down." Sanji followed up with a flurry of kicks, his Diable Jambe igniting his leg with flames. Kronos dodged with ease, his movements fluid and precise, as if he could anticipate every attack before it landed. "Too slow," he taunted, his blade slicing through the air and forcing Sanji to leap back to avoid being cut. Luffy, meanwhile, had activated Gear 4th, his body swelling with power as he launched himself at Kronos with a Kong gun. The force of the punch was enough to shatter the deck beneath them, but Kronos simply raised his hand, the air around him warping as Luffy's attack slowed to a crawl. "Time is my domain," Kronos said, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. "You can't touch me." Mira, seeing her friend struggling, stepped forward, her own blade drawn. "You're not the only one who can manipulate time," she said, her voice steady. Her sword glowed with a soft, blue light as she slashed at Kronos, the blade cutting through the temporal distortion. Kronos' eyes widened in surprise as he was forced to block her attack, the impact sending him skidding back. The fight escalated, each member of the crew testing Kronos' limits. Usopp and Nami provided support from a distance, their attacks forcing Kronos to divide his attention. Frankie unleashed a barrage of rockets, while Robin's Hana Hana no Mi created a flurry of hands to restrain him. But Kronos was relentless, his blade cutting through every obstacle with surgical precision. As the battle raged, tensions within the crew began to surface. Zoro and Sanji, already prone to rivalry, found themselves at odds over how to approach the fight. "Stop getting in my way, Cook," Zoro growled as their attacks collided, giving Kronos an opening to counter. "You're the one who's too slow, Mosshead," Sanji shot back, his frustration boiling over. Luffy, caught in the middle, roared at them to focus. "We can't beat him if we're fighting each other." But even as he spoke, Kronos took advantage of the distraction, his blade slicing through the air and grazing Luffy's arm. Mira, realizing the danger, stepped in. "Enough," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to work together, or we're all going to lose." Her words seemed to snap the crew out of their infighting, and they regrouped, their attacks becoming more coordinated. The tide of the battle began to turn. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji launched a combined assault, their attacks forcing Kronos to retreat. Mira followed up with a powerful strike, her blade cutting through Kronos' defenses and sending him crashing to the deck. For a moment, it seemed like they had won. But Kronos wasn't finished. With a grim smile, he raised his hand, the runes on his blade glowing brighter than ever. "You've forced my hand," he said, his voice cold. "If you won't listen to reason, then I'll erase you from the timeline." The air around him distorted, the very fabric of reality seeming to unravel as he prepared to unleash his ultimate attack. The straw hats braced themselves, knowing that this would be the deciding moment. But before Kronos could strike, a voice rang out from the black ship. "That's enough, Kronos." The crew turned to see a woman standing on the deck of the Tempest pirate's ship, her presence commanding and her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "Mira," she said, her voice soft but firm. "There's more at stake here than you realize. You need to hear the truth." Mira's eyes widened in shock. "Mother?" she whispered, the word barely audible. The revelation hung in the air, shifting the dynamics of the conflict in an instant. Kronos lowered his blade, his expression unreadable, as the woman stepped forward, her gaze locked on Mira. "It's time you knew the full story," she said. "And why I sent you back in the first place." The Straw Hats exchanged uneasy glances, the fight momentarily forgotten as they processed the new development. Myra's mission, the timeline, and the stakes had just become infinitely more complicated. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sea in shadow, the crew knew that their journey was far from over. The storm raged overhead, lightning splitting the sky as the Straw Hat pirates and their mysterious ally, Lena, the self-proclaimed granddaughter of the Pirate King, Monkey D. Luffy, faced off against the enigmatic warlord, Surian, and his fleet of ghost ships. The battle had been brutal, with Surian's forces proving far more formidable than anyone had anticipated. His ability to manipulate time itself had already caused chaos, freezing crew members mid-attack and rewinding their movements to leave them vulnerable. But now, as the fight reached its midpoint, a revelation was about to shatter everything the Straw Hats thought they knew. Lena, her golden hair plastered to her face by the rain, stood at the bow of the Thousand Sunny, her fists clenched. She had been the one to lead them here, claiming that Surian was a threat to the future of the world, a man who sought to rewrite history and erase the legacy of the Pirate King. But as Surian stepped forward, his crimson cloak billowing in the wind, his voice cut through the storm like a blade. "Lena," he said, his tone dripping with mockery, "you've done well to bring them here. But it's time they knew the truth." Luffy, his straw hat tilted low over his eyes, stepped forward. "What's he talking about, Lena?" he demanded, his voice uncharacteristically serious. Lena hesitated, her eyes darting between Surian and the crew. I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He has my brother. He's been holding him captive for years. If I didn't lead you here, he would have killed him." The crew froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Surian laughed, a deep, resonant sound that sent chills down their spines. "Oh, it's even better than that," he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Lena isn't just my pawn. She's my daughter." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Lena's face crumpled, tears mixing with the rain as she fell to her knees. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I never wanted to betray you, but I couldn't let him die." The betrayal cut deep, but there was no time to process it. Surian raised his hand, and the air around him shimmered. "Enough of this," he snarled. "You've served your purpose, Lena. Now, watch as I erase the Straw Hat Pirates from existence." With a flick of his wrist, time seemed to slow, the raindrops hanging suspended in mid-air. Zoro and Sanji, mid-charge, froze in place, their attacks halted. Nami and Usopp, preparing to launch a counterattack, found themselves unable to move. Luffy, however, gritted his teeth and forced himself forward, his willpower defying Surian's temporal manipulation. "I don't care who you are or what you can do," he growled, his fists crackling with conqueror's haki. "No one hurts my crew." He launched himself at Surian, his punch aimed straight for the warlord's face. But Surian smirked and sidestepped with unnatural speed, his own hand glowing with a strange, ethereal light. "Foolish boy," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You cannot defeat time itself." He struck Luffy with a palm strike that sent him flying backward, his body slamming into the mast of the Sunny. The crew watched in horror as Luffy struggled to rise, blood dripping from his mouth. Surian's power was unlike anything they had ever faced, and the stakes had never been higher. If they didn't find a way to counter his abilities, they would all be wiped from existence. Nami, her mind racing, shouted, "We need to disrupt his focus. If we can break his concentration, maybe we can stop him from manipulating time." Usopp nodded, his hands trembling as he loaded a special projectile into his slingshot. "I've got something that might work," he said, his voice shaky but determined. As Surian advanced, his eyes locked on Luffy, Zoro and Sanji broke free from the temporal hold, their sheer willpower overcoming the warlord's power. "You're not the only one who can bend the rules," Zoro growled, his swords gleaming as he unleashed a devastating three-sword style attack. Sanji, his leg wreathed in flames, followed up with a spinning kick aimed at Surian's chest. The warlord blocked both attacks with ease, but the distraction gave Usopp the opening he needed. He fired his projectile, a flashbang grenade filled with sea stone dust, directly at Surian's face. The explosion was blinding, and Surian staggered back, his temporal manipulation faltering. "Now," Nami shouted, summoning a massive thundercloud with her Klima tact. The lightning struck Surian with a deafening crack, forcing him to his knees. But even as the crew pressed their advantage, Surian's laughter echoed through the storm. "You think this is enough to stop me?" he roared, his body beginning to glow with an otherworldly light. I am the master of time. I will rewrite this world as I see fit. Desperation set in as the crew realized they were running out of options. Lena, still kneeling on the deck, clenched her fists and stood. I won't let you do this, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I may be your daughter, but I won't let you destroy everything I care about. She closed her eyes, and a strange energy began to emanate from her body. Surian's eyes widened in shock. No, he whispered. You wouldn't dare. Lena's voice was barely audible over the storm as she spoke. I'm sorry, everyone. This is the only way. With a final, heart-wrenching scream, she unleashed a burst of energy that shattered Surian's temporal field, sending him flying backward. The crew watched in awe as Lena's body began to dissolve into golden light, her sacrifice breaking the warlord's hold on time. Lena, Luffy shouted, reaching out to her, but it was too late. She was gone, her final act saving them all. Surian, his body battered and his power weakened, rose to his feet, his eyes blazing with fury. You think this changes anything? He snarled. I will still destroy you. But the Straw Hats, fueled by grief and determination, were ready. For Lena, Luffy said, his voice low and dangerous. The crew charged as one, their attacks synchronized and relentless. Surian fought back with everything he had, but without his temporal manipulation, he was no match for their combined strength. The battle ended with Luffy delivering a final, devastating punch that sent Surian crashing into the sea, his body sinking beneath the waves. The storm began to dissipate, the sky clearing as the crew stood in silence, their victory bittersweet. Luffy picked up Lena's straw hat, a gift she had given him earlier, and held it tightly. We'll make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain, he said, his voice filled with resolve. The Straw Hat Pirates set sail once more, their hearts heavy but their spirits unbroken, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm raged overhead, thunder cracking like the whip of a vengeful god as the Straw Hat Pirates and their newfound allies scrambled across the jagged cliffs of Kronos Island. The air was thick with tension, the weight of their mission pressing down on them like the oppressive humidity. Luffy's granddaughter, Emi, clutched the ancient, glowing hourglass tightly to her chest, its sands shifting unnaturally, defying gravity. The artifact was the key to stopping the temporal warlord, Kronos D. Tempest, from rewriting history and erasing the Pirate King's legacy. But time was running out, literally. The hourglass's sands were draining faster than before, and with each grain that fell, the world inched closer to unraveling. We've got maybe 6 hours before the timeline collapses, Emi shouted over the howling wind, her voice strained but determined. Her resemblance to Luffy was uncanny, the same fiery determination, the same unshakable will. But where Luffy's strength lay in his raw power and unyielding spirit, Emi's was in her cunning and adaptability. She had spent her life studying the mysteries of time, and now, those lessons were the only thing standing between them and oblivion. Zoro, his 3 swords gleaming despite the storm, grunted in acknowledgement. 6 hours? That's plenty of time to cut down a few time-traveling lunatics. His confidence was unwavering, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. They had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. Tempest wasn't just strong, he was unpredictable, his powers allowing him to manipulate time itself. Every second they wasted was a second he could use to his advantage. Sanji, lighting a cigarette despite the rain, exhaled a plume of smoke. We need a plan. Charging in blind isn't going to work this time. His eyes flicked to Emi, who was already pulling out a tattered map. The island's terrain was treacherous, a labyrinth of cliffs, caves, and ancient ruins. But Emi had spent weeks studying it, and she knew exactly where they needed to go. Tempest's stronghold is here, she said, pointing to a massive, glowing structure at the island's center. But he's not just sitting there waiting for us. He's got an army of time-displaced warriors, some from the past, some from the future. And they're all loyal to him. She paused, her expression darkening. But there's a weakness. Tempest's powers are tied to the temporal core, a device hidden deep within the stronghold. If we can destroy it, we can stop him. Luffy, standing at the edge of the cliff, stared out at the distant stronghold, his straw hat pulled low over his eyes. Then that's where we're going, he said simply. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt. He turned to the crew, his grin as wide and infectious as ever. Let's go kick his ass. The journey to the stronghold was anything but easy. The cliffs were slick with rain, the paths narrow and crumbling. Tempest's forces were everywhere, their attacks relentless. But the Straw Hats were ready. They had spent the last few days training, pushing themselves to their limits. Ami had taught them how to anticipate Tempest's time manipulation techniques, how to disrupt his control over the battlefield. And now, that training was paying off. The first wave of enemies came in the form of a squadron of future tech soldiers, their armor gleaming with an otherworldly light. Zoro met them head-on, his blades a blur of motion. He had been experimenting with a new technique, one that combined his mastery of swordsmanship with Amy's insights into temporal energy. As he slashed through the air, his swords left behind trails of shimmering light, disrupting the soldiers' temporal shields and leaving them vulnerable. Sanji, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of fire and steel. His diable jambe burned brighter than ever, the flames tinged with a faint blue hue, a side effect of his training with ME. He moved with precision and grace, his kicks shattering armor and bone alike. But even he was caught off guard when one of the soldiers activated a time dilation field, slowing his movements to a crawl. It was only thanks to Usopp's quick thinking, and a well-placed explosive pellet, that he managed to break free. Nami and Robin were holding their own, their tactical brilliance and resourcefulness proving invaluable. Nami's Kleam attack had been upgraded with temporal crystals, allowing her to manipulate the weather in ways that defied logic. She summoned a localized storm, the lightning striking with pinpoint accuracy. Robin, meanwhile, had been experimenting with her Hana Hana no Mi powers, creating temporal clones that could move independently for a few seconds before dissipating. It was a risky technique, but one that gave her the edge she needed. As they fought their way through the stronghold's defenses, the stakes grew higher. The hourglass's sands were draining faster now, the timeline unraveling at an alarming rate. Ami could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in reality that made her skin crawl. She knew they were running out of time. Finally, they reached the temporal core, a massive, pulsating machine that hummed with an eerie, otherworldly energy. Tempest was waiting for them, his presence as imposing as the storm outside. "You're too late," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "The timeline is already collapsing. There's nothing you can do to stop it." Luffy stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice steady. The fight that followed was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Tempest's powers were overwhelming, his control over time allowing him to dodge attacks with ease, to rewind injuries, to slow their movements to a crawl. But the Straw Hats were relentless. They fought with everything they had, their experimental tactics and newfound skills pushing them to their limits. Ami, her eyes blazing with determination, focused on the temporal core. She knew it was their only chance. As the others kept Tempest occupied, she began to dismantle the machine, her hands moving with practiced precision. But Tempest wasn't about to let her succeed. He lunged at her, his blade aimed at her heart. It was only thanks to Luffy's quick reflexes, and a well-timed Gear 4th punch, that she was able to avoid the attack. With a final, desperate effort, Ami destroyed the temporal core, the machine exploding in a blinding flash of light. Tempest screamed in rage, his powers faltering as the timeline began to stabilize. But the victory came at a cost. The explosion sent them all flying, the stronghold collapsing around them. As the dust settled, the Straw Hats regrouped, battered but alive. The hourglass in Amy's hands had stopped draining, its sands now still. They had done it. They had stopped Tempest. But as they looked out at the horizon, the storm beginning to clear, they knew their journey was far from over. The Pirate King's legacy was safe, for now. But the world was still full of challenges, and the Straw Hats were ready to face them, together. The air crackled with tension as the battlefield erupted into chaos, the clash of wills and weapons echoing across the stormy skies of the Grand Line. Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, and the rest of the Straw Hat crew stood battered but unyielding, their eyes locked on their adversaries, a rogue faction of Marines led by the enigmatic Admiral Kurogane, whose mastery of armament hockey had turned him into a living fortress. At the center of it all was Luffy's time-traveling granddaughter, Rika, her fists clenched and her resolve burning brighter than ever. The fate of the future hung in the balance, and every second counted. Luffy charged forward first, his rubbery body stretching as he launched a devastating Gamu Gamu no Red Hawk. The fiery punch collided with Kurogane's hockey-infused shield, sending shockwaves rippling through the ground. "You're strong, old man," Luffy growled, his voice steady despite the strain, "but I'm not backing down." Kurogane smirked, his obsidian black arm deflecting the attack with ease. "Strength alone won't save you, Straw Hat. You'll need more than brute force to defeat me." Zoro, ever the strategist, saw an opening and lunged forward, his three swords gleaming in the dim light. "Santoru, Onigiri," he roared, his blade slicing through the air with precision. Kurogane countered with a swift upward strike, his hockey-clad fist meeting Zoro's swords in a shower of sparks. The impact sent Zoro skidding backward, but he quickly regained his footing, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted his grip. "This guy's tough," Zoro muttered, "but I've faced worse." With a deep breath, he activated his Asura form, his aura flaring as 9 spectral arms materialized behind him. "Let's see how you handle this." Sanji, meanwhile, was locked in a high-speed duel with Kurogane's second-in-command, a nimble swordsman named Shiro. Their movements were a blur, Sanji's fiery kicks clashing against Shiro's lightning-fast slashes. "You're quick," Sanji admitted, his voice laced with irritation, "but you're not landing a hit on me." He spun into a Diable Jambe, flambéed shot, the flames on his leg intensifying as he aimed a spinning kick at Shiro's midsection. Shiro barely managed to block it, his sword trembling under the force. "You're stronger than I expected," Shiro conceded, his voice strained, "but I'm not done yet." With a burst of speed, he unleashed a flurry of slashes, forcing Sanji to dodge and counter with equal ferocity. Rika, standing at the heart of the battlefield, felt the weight of her lineage pressing down on her. She knew she had to push past her limits if she wanted to protect her friends and secure the future. Drawing on her mastery of observation haki, she anticipated Kurogane's next move and intercepted him with a powerful punch, her fist glowing with Conqueror's haki. The clash sent a shockwave through the air, the ground cracking beneath their feet. "You're not the only one with haki," Rika declared, her voice steady despite the strain. Kurogane's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "Impressive," he admitted, "but you're still just a child playing at being a hero." The battle raged on, each side pushing themselves to their absolute limits. Luffy, realizing that his usual attacks weren't enough, tapped into Gear 4th, Snakeman, his body becoming a blur of speed and power. "You're not getting away," he shouted, his fists flying in a relentless barrage of punches. Kurogane struggled to keep up, his defenses faltering under the sheer intensity of Luffy's assault. This is impossible," he growled, his voice tinged with frustration. But even as he faltered, he refused to back down, his haki flaring as he launched a counterattack. Zoro, seeing an opportunity, unleashed his most powerful technique yet. "Kyuteryu, Dragon Blaze," he roared, his swords cutting through the air with such force that they left trails of fire in their wake. The attack struck Kurogane head-on, the explosion sending him flying backward. But the Admiral wasn't done yet. With a roar of defiance, he surged forward, his haki-infused fists slamming into Zoro's swords with enough force to shatter them. Zoro gritted his teeth, his arms trembling under the strain, but he refused to yield. "I'm not done yet," he growled, his voice filled with determination. Sanji, meanwhile, had finally gained the upper hand against Shiro. With a series of rapid kicks, he broke through Shiro's defenses, landing a devastating Diable Jambe, Muten shot that sent the swordsman crashing to the ground. "Stay down," Sanji said, his voice cold but resolute. But as he turned to rejoin the fight, he was blindsided by a surprise attack from Kurogane, who had broken free from Luffy and Zoro's combined assault. The Admiral's fist connected with Sanji's side, sending him sprawling. "You're all out of your league," Kurogane sneered, his voice filled with contempt. Rika, seeing her friends fall one by one, felt a surge of anger and determination. She knew she had to end this, no matter the cost. Drawing on every ounce of her strength, she unleashed a devastating combination of armament and Conqueror's haki, her fists glowing with an otherworldly light. "This ends now," she shouted, her voice echoing across the battlefield. With a final, powerful punch, she struck Kurogane with enough force to send him flying, his defenses shattering under the sheer power of her attack. The Admiral crashed to the ground, his body trembling as he struggled to rise. You've surpassed me," he admitted, his voice filled with grudging respect. As the dust settled, the Straw Hats stood victorious, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji exchanged weary smiles, their bond stronger than ever. Rika, standing at the center of it all, felt a sense of pride and relief wash over her. They had pushed past their limits, adapted to the challenges before them, and emerged stronger for it. But as they looked out over the battlefield, they knew their journey was far from over. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but they were ready to face it, together. The air was thick with tension, the battlefield a chaotic storm of clashing swords, erupting haki, and the deafening roar of the sea. Luffy, battered and bloodied, stood at the center of it all, his straw hat barely clinging to his head. Across from him, the Pirate King's time-traveling granddaughter, Amara, wielded her inherited Conqueror's haki with a ferocity that matched her grandfather's legacy. Her eyes burned with determination, her resolve unshaken even as her body screamed for rest. The fate of the universe hung in the balance, and neither side could afford to falter. Amara's blade, a gleaming katana forged from the same steel as Roger's own, clashed against Luffy's hardened fists. Sparks flew as their haki collided, the shock waves rippling across the battlefield and sending nearby combatants tumbling. "You're strong, Luffy," Amara admitted, her voice strained but steady. "But I can't let you destroy the future I've fought so hard to protect." Luffy gritted his teeth, his Gear 4th form pulsating with energy. "I'm not trying to destroy anything. I just want my crew to be free, and I'll fight anyone who stands in our way." The ground beneath them cracked as they pushed against each other, their powers reaching their absolute limits. Amara's time fruit abilities allowed her to manipulate the flow of time around her, creating temporal distortions that disoriented her opponents. She flickered in and out of existence, her strikes coming from impossible angles. But Luffy's observation haki had grown sharper with every battle, and he anticipated her movements, countering with devastating blows that shook the very air. Nearby, Zoro and Sanji fought side by side against Amara's elite guards, their synergy a testament to years of camaraderie. Zoro's 3 swords moved like a whirlwind, cutting through the enemy's defenses with precision, while Sanji's flaming kicks left craters in the ground. "Keep up, Mosshead," Sanji taunted, dodging a barrage of projectiles. "TCH, you're the one slowing me down, curly brow," Zoro shot back, though a smirk betrayed his amusement. Despite their banter, their focus never wavered, their determination to protect their captain driving them forward. As the battle raged on, Amara began to falter. Her time manipulation abilities were draining her stamina, and the toll of fighting Luffy was becoming unbearable. She staggered, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but her resolve remained unbroken. "I won't let you win," she whispered, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I can't." Luffy, sensing her weakening, lowered his guard slightly. "Why are you doing this? What's so important about this future you're trying to protect?" Amara's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her hardened exterior. Because I've seen what happens if I fail. The world falls into chaos, and everyone I love, everyone you love, is lost. I can't let that happen." Luffy's expression shifted, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. "Then let's find another way. Fighting like this isn't going to solve anything." The battlefield seemed to pause, the weight of Luffy's words hanging in the air. Amara hesitated, her grip on her sword loosening. But before she could respond, a sudden explosion rocked the area, sending both combatants flying. From the smoke emerged Blackbeard, his laughter echoing across the battlefield. "Looks like I arrived just in time to clean up this mess," he sneered, his dark energy radiating malice. Amara's eyes widened in horror. "No. This can't be happening. He wasn't supposed to be here." Blackbeard's arrival shifted the dynamics of the battle entirely. His dual devil fruit powers made him a near unstoppable force, and his presence threatened to tip the scales in his favor. Luffy and Amara exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Truce?" Luffy asked, extending a hand. Amara nodded, gripping it firmly. "Truce. For now." The two unlikely allies turned to face Blackbeard, their combined strength a formidable counter to his overwhelming power. Luffy unleashed a barrage of Gear 4th attacks, his fists moving faster than the eye could follow, while Amara manipulated time to create openings in Blackbeard's defenses. The battle was a blur of motion, each strike carrying the weight of their shared determination. Blackbeard roared in frustration, his attacks growing more erratic as he struggled to keep up. In a final, desperate move, Blackbeard unleashed a massive shockwave of darkness, threatening to consume everything in its path. Luffy and Amara stood side by side, their haki merging into a single, unstoppable force. "Now," Luffy shouted, and together they unleashed a combined attack that shattered Blackbeard's darkness and sent him crashing to the ground, defeated. The battlefield fell silent, the echoes of their victory reverberating through the air. Amara collapsed to her knees, her strength finally giving out. Luffy, though exhausted, remained standing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did it," he said softly, a smile breaking through his weariness. Amara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. For showing me there's another way." In the aftermath, the universe began to shift. The timeline Amara had fought so hard to protect was altered, but not in the way she had feared. Instead of chaos, a new future emerged, one where cooperation and understanding replaced conflict. The Straw Hat Pirates and their allies celebrated their hard-fought victory, but the scars of battle remained, a reminder of the cost of their triumph. As the sun set on the horizon, Luffy and Amara stood together, watching the waves crash against the shore. "What will you do now?" Luffy asked. Amara smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. I think it's time I found my own path. Maybe I'll even join your crew for a while." Luffy laughed, his trademark grin returning. "Sounds like an adventure." And so, the Pirate King's time-traveling granddaughter set sail with the Straw Hat Pirates, her journey far from over. The universe had been reshaped by their actions, and though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The legacy of the Pirate King lived on, not in the past, but in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow.